Hey Theo,
Hey Pranab,
how are you?
good to see you again.
Good to see you again. So last time in our first recording, we talked through an introduction to parts work, somatic work, the imaginal, um, from our own experience as a kind of just whole total introduction to someone who may have slightly heard it but really doesn't know much about it, and we kind of just walk through a lot of those considerations and facets. So today, I think we're going to be talking more about for people who've listened to that going deeper. Uh, we may have somewhat sold that type of work before, oh yeah, you really should do this. But today we're going to start off with kind of the limitations of parts work, and maybe why it's not as worth it. And then going into much more about meditation and our relationship to meditation, and how parts work folds into that. So yeah, let's get started.
Yeah, this is exciting. And yeah, let's directly jump in uh, into the limitations of parts work as we have experienced it. And I think a good place to start would be how parts work and the whole literature and ideas around it are very verbal in nature. And I feel after a point, the whole verbal nature of parts work can be quite limiting. And I feel there's no reason why you cannot communicate with your parts non-verbally or even telepathically, or just like for me at some point, parts work became very much like energy work, where
Mm,
I was just doing moves in my mind, in my body, and it was unfolding and it was quite illegible even to me, but
mm.
it did not matter because it was still helping me do the same things, helping me let go of avoid intention and helping me integrate disown feelings. So yeah, I think yeah, that's a good place to start and would be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like within parts work, there's almost two failure modes, which is kind of when you've graduated, quote unquote, from it, and some of the rules and structures set by modalities like IFS, internal family systems, start to become blockers, which I think we kind of both are starting to feel as it relates to some meditation stuff. And then other limitations are maybe when onboarding. Maybe this is for later on, but curious who like how do people find part like the people who find parts work very difficult like that. I think as you're getting started on there might be some kind of like activation energy or a learning curve. I think there's two sides of it. And yeah, on the yeah, curious what you think on, like, in your experience talking to people, have there been people who have had like a difficulty kind of getting into it, or like maybe uh should have been more with the analytical talk therapy CBT type work, or is it kind of like, or is it fine? Like anyone can really start.
I I do feel like anyone can start because in my experience I have had a chance to explore with people with varying level of exposure to these ideas, and goes to even like zero exposure or sometimes even zero exposure to the world of therapy. And I feel because parts work is so relational in nature, the idea of interacting with parts is comes quite naturally to people. What is challenging for a lot of people is finding the channels that work for them. And this is where for a lot of people, like the verbal channel is just so readily accessible. And also there's this limitation that if I am facilitating an experience for someone, currently I am limited by words, like I can only communicate with them through words, or like some non-verbal stuff happens, but I can mostly give them instructions through words. And so for people whom the verbal uh, channel is not their dominant channel or not as developed or not their preferred channel, I guess they might experience some yeah challenges. And then yeah, this ties back to the point that when they go out exploring how to get unblocked, again all the literature and all the ideas are very verbal in nature.
Right.
And so I think yeah, there's yeah some scope here where working with images just images and the felt experience can lead to a very interesting parts work experience even without actually interacting verbally with any of your parts or having conversations, because I think conversations is usually the uh, yeah, the key thing in IFS
Yeah.
experience to hear people talk about their experience, and it's very narrative based. So but yeah, I feel that narrative based thing can itself be the limitation, and
Yeah.
you can just transcend narratives a lot of time.
So a way to reflect that back, you see that it's the verbal aspect of it is emphasized in a lot of ways because it's easy. A lot of people are verbal, so it's easy for them to describe the experience and narrativize.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, that eventually becomes a limitation for many. Um, where in a lot of the sessions you've done, you might have seen that people have moved from verbal to a less verbal or kind of like an imaginal or somatic movement. And there's, it's hard to communicate that. All that has to be communicated verbally, but it's all more felt. And it sounds like by verbal you also mean conceptual. Like it's often like a purely conceptual thing, and it moves down into the layer of movement or flow or body sensation. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. And yeah, this is also one reason why I tell people that, yeah, I recommend people to not, yeah, play out their conversations out loud, because
Mm,
uh, you can just have so many conversations, or just you can just communicate non-verbally a lot of times and not even realize that you are communicating non-verbally. And so in that sense, I encourage people to just, yeah, just lean into what feels right in their mind or in their body, and allow their heart to take the lead, and
yeah.
whatever that means for them.
That's wonderful. I think it's interesting because what that brings up in mind for me is there can be this view of IFS or this view of parts work in general that it's negotiating between your parts.
Mm.
Uh, that okay, I want to negotiate between things and kind of have the whole system kind of agree on a thing or kind of come up with some compromise. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but I'm curious your takes on it. It seems like there might be some use to that, but also some limitations.
Yeah, yeah, I think yeah, what you said, that that's not necessarily wrong. It can definitely be useful. Deal making can be useful a lot of times when you can't just change things overnight. You can, yeah, still do what I think Malcolm Ocean calls trust dancing, where you maybe bring two parts together and like mediate a conversation between them and have a trust dance. But I do feel like negotiation in general, because of the cultural connotations associated with it, usually has some agendas packed in. And whenever agendas creep in, yeah, parts can sense that and get their guards up. And yeah, another way to think of agendas, it's like it's just another part that has that agenda to fix things or to change things. And yeah, even that's just another part that you can connect with and request to let go.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like by having that negotiation model of parts work, in some ways you're actually allowing a certain agenda to come to mind. Because I think a negotiation can imply that there's some outcome you want and that you're trying to, move things in that direction, which, can be fine, but it also is kind of against the purpose of this more allowing unconditionality kind approach to revealing what needs to be there.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And even the uh, general IFS agenda of healing can be
mm,
counterproductive, right? People can end up trying to be curious or compassionate uh, as a means to an end of
yeah,
healing some part. And whenever that happens, like, I always see that the protector parts are very good at sensing that agenda. They can sense that and get their guards up. They won't feel safe
yeah,
in your presence as long as you still blend it in with that agenda. And so, um, especially with curiosity, I think this agenda can creep in very subtly. You're just asking questions, trying to understand, but you're seeking some answers. And
Mm.
so this is where the distinction between wonder and curiosity that Joe Hudson makes is really interesting, where he says that wonder is being in curiosity without looking for an answer. And I feel distinctions like that, uh, and being sensitive to that, what curiosity with agenda feels like, what compassion with agenda feels like, and what it feels like without agenda, can, yeah, just bring much more emotional safety within you and for your parts, and open things up a lot more.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's interesting because it sounds kind of like a progressive model in the sense that, in someone's first IFS session, or even just the first few weeks of doing some kind of parts work exploration, I don't think you will go in without an agenda. Like, I couldn't imagine myself just being curious, because I think there were things I had things I wanted to do, I had intentions. Um and in some ways, like, going in with purely no agenda, it's like, why would I even be there? Right? But it's
Mhm.
I think that's a weird tension to
Yeah,
wrangle, because in some ways, like, and one way I've resolved it is, you have an intention leading up to it, but then when you're there, you just drop your intention as much as possible. Just fully drop.
yeah,
Almost like in meditation. It's like people often say, "Oh yeah, you shouldn't have any goals in meditation." And, well, no, you're there for a reason. You have an arc to it. There's a purpose. Otherwise, like, you wouldn't be doing this thing. Um, but I think you use the motivation, or you have the motivation to show up and to do it, and then ideally, when you're on the cushion or doing the practice, you just totally drop and have complete curiosity within that boundary, to explore. And that is kind of how I've navigated it. But yeah, yeah,
yeah,
it changes over time. Over the arc of a practice, over months and years, I feel like it shifts and there's
yeah,
more skill.
yeah, definitely resonate a lot with that. And in some sense, the initial agenda can be seen as scaffolding to get you to some point, and once you get there, you can let go of that. But yeah, being sensitive to it is important, because then, even if you can't let go of it today, just being sensitive to it initiates the process of letting go of it 5 months later, or even 5 years later.
Yeah, yeah, lots of interesting threads there. Uh, yeah, let's make sure we have the verbal part. So kind of, how have you seen people move from conceptual to imaginal or somatic? And yeah, and what does that look like for you?
Mm. I think over time, at least in my personal practice, things have become more and more nebulous. And this actually ties into one another failure mode of IFS, which is reification. And so, like, if I were to look back at my initial explorations, I would definitely reify parts, make them into this solid thing, like actual part that exists within me and that I can interact with again and again, and even check in on a daily basis. And while that was really useful at some point, uh, I think over time, you realize that the whole idea of parts work is just a way of seeing, and there aren't actually any parts per se. And you also see how, as you are doing these explorations, as you are progressing in your journey, parts change their forms quite a bit, even from like session to session. And that brings in a sense of nebulosity to your exploration, that things are very much in flux, they are flowing, and I can temporarily give them form to interact with those parts, to connect with those parts and get deeper, but also being very yeah, also seeing all these structures as very loosely held, very flowy, ephemeral, and being okay with letting go of certain parts. I remember that initially, I like used to like have a notebook with a list of all my parts, even name them, like what the roles are. And I very quickly realized that that didn't really have any use beyond one point, because the parts just keep changing and evolving so much.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think honing in on that. I think this idea of scaffolding is really helpful because I think this, having a journal of all your parts and naming them and mapping them and seeing the persona, I believe that's advocated for in a lot of the IFS books. And I think that's a great practice. I personally haven't, for other reasons, haven't gotten as much out of it, but I have friends who have, and it seems quite useful, again, to a point. Because, once you get that intimate familiarity with your interiority and with different aspects of the psyche, that's great. And it's sometimes, I think, having that rich study can be helpful there. And over time, it's likely that that may uh, push them away from growth or change that would naturally occur. And it can, you can be kind of looking for those things in your
Yeah,
current experience over time, again and again, when they're actually not there. Um, yeah, and kind of, so, and getting into this reification versus nebulosity thing, because, and these are kind of jargony words that we both are pretty
yeah,
familiar with from our practice. But yeah, one way of seeing it is, so reification is like to reify is to make it something, to make it a thing, to thingify something.
yeah,
uh thingifying things gives them a sense of solidity, a sense of, it's both the view that, oh yeah, that's real, that's like, it's real, and it's also a perception. Like, typically things that are reified feel weighty in one's experience, if you, in the phenomenology. um and this is, it's really interesting because it's so conceptual, but it eventually becomes like a felt sense or like an experienced thing. And the opposite of reification is nebulosity, spaciousness, emptiness. There's a few ways of describing it. um and it's this, like, seeing the ephemerality of a thing. Like, yeah, you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings. There's more space, it's more, you know that it's changing, that it's impermanent, that it's shifting and moving and flowing. There's just a lot more kind of like aliveness to it, because that's how it in some ways really is, or both it really is, and you can see it in that way, and by seeing it in that way, it actually feels much better. um, so that's like our short summary of the,
yeah,
multiple centuries of reification versus emptiness talk. But
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah. That was really good. And I'll just add a quick example to it so that the whole thing becomes more visual. So let's say some anger is arising for you in some context, and you can see this anger arising in your chest, and like you feel this emotion, and there's a narrative associated with it. And so one move here is to see this energy arising, see these sensations arising as a part of you that is angry, and give a form to this part, and even try to, let's say, visualize it. Okay, this part has a body language, this part has a personality and a way of being, and there are some specific things that the part is angry about. And um, this process of reification, in some sense, giving form to these sensations, now gives you the freedom to interact with it, to connect with it, and even understand it better. And another move here is noticing those sensations and uh, seeing them, like seeing this whole thing as just a cluster of like little sensations. And uh, like even seeing, like one way to, like one metaphor that really resonates with me is like seeing it as a confetti of sensations arising in your chest, and like uh, separating them out into components, and see that it's just uh, some tingling happening in your chest, and just a collection of random sensations even. And so like this is the spectrum on one end where we like give form to interact with it, and another end where we just like disintegrate it or deconstruct it to see that it's empty. And what we were saying is that in IFS we do this reification thing because it's really useful, and it also leads to freedom and spaciousness a lot of times. But yeah, one failure mode is like we can constantly refi it, and also basically get caught up in stories and narratives, which is another failure mode, that uh, we end up relying on like stories or narratives to understand ourselves, without seeing that all stories are made up or empty.
yeah, love that. And I think what that brings up for me is expanding that spectrum a bit more, where there is also kind of default way of seeing things. Like, what is default anger? What is default heartbreak? And if someone didn't do any type of emotional work or things like that, and that's like very reified by default. It's like extremely reified, and in some ways, not just reified, but you're like adding to it. It becomes a really, really big thing.
Yeah.
Like, you can imagine road rage at a stranger, or heartbreak, where road rage at a stranger, where you have this. It's all purely story. In some ways, you might even be disconnected with the actual sense in the body. It's just like anger is almost just a thought. Like, you don't even see it as a thing that you can experience and feel, and it's caught up in this, just the thought of like, that person's really wrong, I'm really good, and then that's like ultimate reified,
Yeah.
or in heartbreak, well, that person's a monster, how could they do this to me, and they're terrible. That's like pure conceptual, pure narrative, uh totally reified, and doesn't feel very good. It's like,
Mhm.
it leads to like not great actions in the world, and just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel healthy. And I think in some ways, a lot of the project of therapy is to get someone from there, uh, or at least how I've seen it typically done, is to get someone from there to this next step of like, okay, start feeling it in the body, know that it actually can be, you can slow it down. You don't have to believe that story. And even like, you're de-reifying, or you're kind of de-solidifying that a bit, but you're kind of solidifying maybe this other narrative, like, oh, you feel this thing, and you have this other stuff. And with parts work, you're deconstructing even more into like, oh yeah, that's just a part of you, that's not you. And then you can feel more of these sensations, and then you can deconstruct even more, where it's like, oh, but that's made up of all these different sensations. Moment to moment, those sensations are changing. Like, oh, actually, that part has different motivations. Underneath it is maybe sadness or some other thing, and you just see it shifting and changing. And each of these steps, you can get stuck within that kind of view that this is how it is. But I think the key thing is seeing it all as like ways of looking. And as you progress, or as one progresses with this, more ways of looking and more modes and more moves opens up towards, I can imagine. And I'm not quite haven't quite experienced it, but there's this, one thing I have had earlier this year is I had a lot of anger, which is a thing that I typically have suppressed for many years. And by seeing anger and letting go of the, like, doing a pretty decent job at letting go of the story of it, it really just felt like energy, and just pure energy. And it definitely felt, it had angry qualities to it, but it was more energetic and allowed me to do stuff. And it's one of those things where I don't think any of this ever, it may, but it doesn't, it's not, the point is not to have these things go away. I think oftentimes when you're entering this type of work, I don't want to feel angry anymore. I don't want to feel sad anymore.
Yeah.
I just want, I just want to feel good. And what's interesting is that view goes away, where you will always feel angry, or there will be anger, there will be sadness,
Yeah.
but the way of experiencing it changes so much that it doesn't even seem like anger. It doesn't even seem like sadness. Um, yeah, with the breakup a few years ago, I think I felt physical heartbreak for the first time. It's just like, it was like actually painful in my chest. But
Mhm.
what was interesting is I allowed myself to just get into that, and I think some psilocybin microdosing helped, and meditation helped, and I think I had gotten a little bit into the self therapy stuff with IFS at that time. But yeah, it noticed the parts of me that wanted to demonize that other person, and things like that. And I kind of just allowed myself to relax and just feel my feelings. And that, I think, is what processing emotion is, just allowing things to flow and just be felt. And then I think it keeps shifting and moving and changing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates too. And yep, what you were talking about, anger, reminded me of this thing which is somewhat discouraged in IFS, or at least not encouraged, which is blending in. And I feel it can be really useful to just blend in with your parts. And what can happen is, like, one of the other failure modes is that once you become very proficient with IFS, or that becomes a default way of seeing, you start looking at every emotion as parts. And so then you, like, anything that arises in your experience, you then habitually bring in this parts work frame. And I feel it can sometimes end up creating distance uh, from your parts. And so sometimes a really valuable and wise move when, let's say, anger arises, is to just lean into that anger, allow yourself to feel angry, and allow that energy to move through you. And a contrasting thing can be like you try to like bring in your part's work lens and see that anger is a part, try to interact with that part. And I think this can be somewhat grindy at times, or maybe restrictive of the flow of the energy. And yeah, sometimes it's useful to just blend in with a part and allow yourself to be angry, or blend in with a part and allow yourself to be scared, which I think is a really powerful move. And or like another thing, like just blend in with an exile and just feel that sadness, like allow your heart to break, like allow that grief to ripen you, or allow that helplessness to like be felt fully, like surrender to that helplessness, surrender to having no control. And like all these moves are really useful and not really discussed in the IFS literature or parts work literature.
Yeah, it's quite, those are quite powerful, and also I guess can be dangerous.
Yes.
Um, where I think it's interesting in some of the more non-dual um, meditation styles I do, sometimes there's like a just fully surrender to whatever's there, just bear towards that experience, which is great. And it's also like when you start hearing that, it's like, oh my God, I don't want to do that. That sounds
Yeah.
painful. So do you feel like what I don't know if this is maybe too strong of a word, but like prerequisites or recommendations or skills to develop, to like if someone's not ready to do that, to kind of ramp into that. And yeah, and I wonder if it's like building up more self energy, or this like more reserve of well-being, or knowing that it's empty. It almost, there's, it feels like there's a few things that can be developed that help allowing to just fully feel that pain or that exile, or that, that part blending in. I'm
Yeah.
curious your thoughts there.
Yeah. What comes to me right off the top of my head is, so one thing definitely that you could do is like check in with yourself if it feels safe to lean into a particular emotion, and check in with your body, like check in with any other parts that are concerned, and do it in a way that uh, is not foresee, or is not again like coming in with an agenda, or seeing it as the quote unquote efficient thing to do. But yeah, check in with yourself and see if you have the space, rather than like separating yourself from the part and trying to interact with it. Sometimes there's space available to just inhabit the emotional reality of the part. And um, yeah, it can be really powerful. Other thing that comes to mind is, I think some of the Alexander technique moves of expanding awareness can be really useful in this context, where I think what goes wrong when people get overwhelmed sometimes is that their attention collapses onto that painful emotion, and it becomes really overwhelming, it becomes constricting, and that can be a really uncomfortable place to be. But having some of the Alexander technique moves available at your disposal, just like stretching out your awareness, as Rob Burbia says, or just becoming aware of the space around you or above you, becoming aware of the ground that's holding you. Just doing these little moves can create more spaciousness for that feeling. And then you can invite that feeling to take up more space, or just allow yourself to feel it more fully in this spacious container. And one other thing that comes to mind is the general skill of equanimity. If you have a meditation practice, or even if you don't, even in parts work, you can notice the different ways in which you are pushing away an experience where you are maybe clinging on to some sense of safety. And to the degree it feels safe to do so, learn to let go of it and build up this general skill of equanimity, which also builds up your nervous system's capacity to handle a strong emotional charge. And this general skill then translates very well to you being able to go deeper and connect more deeply with your parts. And so, yeah, these are some things that come right away. I would be very
Yeah.
curious to get your thoughts and what has worked for you in this context.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I think a lot of what you said, and for what has worked for me, is really kind of this general uh skill tree of building well-being, or building a sense of well-being, tapping into a reservoir of well-being. um that I think, and it's interesting because I think IFS's concept of self, capital S self, with the 8 C's, I don't remember all of them, compassionate, curious, calm, things like that, that taps at this. But I think it can be generalized and deepened in a lot of ways. And this is where meditation comes in as well, where it's not, this self energy. Um, it's like that well-being can come from so many different ways and processes. I think in the first talk we talked about, when you're first getting into this, you can, and how I learned it is you can like do self-touch. You can give yourself like a hug, or kind of warm, or think of like a close friend. And I think those are kind of intro moves that are quite good at just getting you into this. But there's this general sense that over time, when you do both, I think there's a couple aspects of it on the equanimity side and the love side, and then the kind of just general pleasure side. There's maybe three aspects. um, they all lead to the sense of just safety and power and holding, but there's different way angles to get at it. But there are different practices one can do over time that lead to this, over months and years, this deep sense of safety and well-being. And yeah, Alexander technique, or spacious awareness practice, non-dual openness practice, that's one class of things where you're able to open up, get space. And for me, that's been very powerful. Meditations from Michael Taft and Locke Kelly are quite helpful there. There's also metta practice, loving kindness practice, and general Brahma Vihara, or the infinite abodes in Buddhism, which is feeling this sense of care and compassion and happiness for others. And eventually that becomes, and ways to do that are wishing people well, or even just simple gratitude practice, like is often talked about. But that ends up becoming like a sense in the body. And then once that becomes a sense in the body, I think that's a milestone moment where you can really rise that up and have that grow. And the third is just jhana, which see, like kind of falling into that. There's this thing that is intrinsic to the human body that is just like not very discussed, which is that once you kind of find a sense of well-being and pleasure, attention can create a looping effect. I
Yeah.
think people are really familiar with it with anxiety, where you have a little bit of anxiety, and even depression. So with a little bit of anxiety, you put your attention there, and that creates a physiological response that creates more anxiety, and then
Yeah.
it kind of can spiral. With depression, there's a spiral of feeling hopeless or feeling sad, feeling frustrated, and then putting attention there, reifying it a bit more, and just getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and then you're kind of just stuck for a while. Um, Thankfully, it also exists on the other side, which
Yeah.
is when you tap into a feeling of love and warmth or pleasure. You can just put more and more attention to that, and in some ways that increases the energy going to that structure, and it can just start looping in a really, really interesting, pleasant, positive feedback, where you feel jittery and you feel nice, and you kind of just start paying attention to those sensations, and maybe it takes over your whole body and you just feel really good, and you can kind of just lean into that a lot. um, and that becomes these meditation states known as the jhanas, which I don't have as much experience with personally, but I think the concept of being able to put attention towards pleasant and abundant qualities is very powerful. And so that's a whole class of techniques of like accessing this reservoir well-being, that some people say is inner well-being, some people say you're surrendering and just receiving this well-being, but really just kind of able to access that. And for me, I've kind of had some experience with all those facets, and it's just really helped, where now when difficult sensation comes up, it's less so like, how do I even deal with this, to like remembering that, oh yeah, I could just sit for a couple of minutes and just access a little bit of niceness and safety. And it always can feel a little bit better if I just take some time for myself. Um, and then it opens up a lot more moves on, accessing this with friends and talking to people about this and opening up. So yeah, this well-being quality I think is very powerful. And I don't think IFS's self-concept goes deep enough. Eventually, like in our work together, you can do things like core transformation or other things to go even deeper into this just general global sense of total spaciousness and total ease and total love, or things like that, that fundamentally can be like the ground of experience. that can, lead to a lot of good stuff and transformation.
Yeah. So many interesting trailheads there. And I'm not sure which one I want to pick. But like one thing that came up while you were talking about core transformation was how, so yes, things like jhanas can be really useful and valuable for parts work, but parts work can also make
Mm.
jhanas accessible, right? And people do experience a lot of like well-being and joy and spaciousness and peace when they uh, like move through some painful feeling in IFS and like unburden an exiled part. And so even in that space, like I often invite uh, my clients to just, yeah, take a few moments to enjoy this feeling and just stay with it, allow it to spread out in the body, and just give yourself the permission to feel this well-being. And yeah, even that can just amplify that feeling. And in core transformation, of course, you have the core states, and you can, yeah, just get to a core state, get to this really beautiful, pleasurable state, and then just stay there, amplifying it with your attention, create this positive feedback loop that you were talking about. And so, in that sense, for people for whom concentration meditation is not really easy or not really accessible, parts work can be uh, really like good on ramp into meditation in general, but also even like concentration states in general.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I think seeing the what is this for, answering that question is interesting. And I think over time, it kind of moves and shifts between things. So like for a lot of emotional work, the what is this for is to like heal my suffering or to feel better. And oftentimes the assumption there is I will feel bad and I will feel all my dirt and gunk and I'll see what's wrong with me and things like that. And there's kind of these like underlying attitudes around it. And then with, which is inherently it's partially true, but also a lot of it, to do that, you tap into your inner well-being and seeing how you're not broken, how you're not there's nothing wrong with you, and you tap into and in some ways those thoughts or views might be a little triggering at first, but you tap into just this feeling of safety, and that grows. With meditation, the often view of meditation is like, I'm going to grind and see the truth and get wisdom. But and funny enough, I think there as well, having a sense of kindness and a sense of kind of like being on the same page collectively in the psyche actually allows you to do that much more easily. And there's much more progress in that way on the insight path. And then and then when you're trying to cultivate a sense of love or of warmth and well-being, um, to do that, it's like you almost like insight and relational work help a lot there too. It's like if you're trying to get a sense of like enjoyable concentration or bliss states or things like that, it's like they all just fold into each other, which I think is a great time to bring up Romeo Stevens. He has this he's a meditation blogger dude that has a really good diagram called the threefold training, which is adapted from early Buddhism, but I think he does a great job of explaining it. Yeah, Theo, what do you think about it?
Yeah.
Or I guess describe it first.
Okay. So I will butcher it up in some sense, but so the three pillars of the threefold training are: one is integration practices, and this includes therapy, this includes relational practices like authentic relating, this includes somatic work. And the idea is to, in some sense, connect with your body, connect with the disowned feelings, and yeah, integrate those fragmented aspects of your mind to move towards more wholeness. And the idea is that integration practices like these, like IFS being one of them, will create good conditions for concentration practices. My understanding of it is that as you clear up this gunk in your mind, as you let go of a lot of defensive ways of being, as you let go of the critical voice inside your head. um, as all of this gets freed up, there's now more ease and energy available for concentration states. And um, this could be simple focusing on a breath concentration, which is most people's introduction to meditation. Or this could also be like using the Brahma Viharas, like you mentioned before, like Metta or uh, Upekha, and using them as concentration objects. And as the concentration deepens, it creates like good conditions for insight practices, to understand the nature of mind, nature of suffering, and get this global insight into uh, what causes suffering in the first place, what yeah creates all these unprocessed painful feelings that we are trying to process through integration practices. And what also happens inevitably with insight practices is that as you get insight into nature of suffering and then start letting go of a lot of your unwholesome or defensive ways of being, it will now naturally bring up um, some painful feelings to the surface that those defensive ways of being were keeping suppressed. And so insight then again flows back into integration. And so like it gives you an opportunity to process more of that stuff, and then yeah, on we go again to concentration. So
Yeah.
creates virtuous loop. And what's specifically interesting for me is that most people's introduction to spiritual path is through concentration meditation practices. If you pick up Headspace or any uh, common meditation instruction, it's yeah, focus on your breath, try to stay with it. If you get distracted, come back to it. And naturally, this is quite difficult for a lot of people because people are still caught up in the voice inside their head and a lot of tension in their body. And what feels like a much more easier on ramp is integration practices, especially like something like parts work, which can help you develop a more kind, compassionate relationship with yourself and your parts. And over time, bring more ease and harmony in your mind, which will then naturally make concentration easier, like this model talks about. And yeah, curious to get your take on it.
Yeah, fully agreed. And we'll put a link to the article he has about this. So, because, you know, you can't really, you can only explain a visual diagram so much. It's better just to see. But yeah, I think, yeah, the thing about it that really unlocked for me, similar to what you said, so many people start meditation on this concentration path and not seeing, and maybe they kind of understand inside a little bit, but they don't see how integration and this kind of emotional untangling work and unbinding work and well-being work really helps. It's fantastic. Similarly, a lot of people are on this pure insight path, especially if you've read kind of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha or do a lot of dry noting or really intense vipassana or body scanning type practice. You often push through or override the kind of more difficult parts of the psyche. And even though, there may be a way of seeing that there's like defensive parts or less wholesome parts, none of these are bad within like this integrative framework. None of them are actually globally bad and not shouldn't exist. They're all there for a reason. And it may be that it falls over time and it may not be, but the main thing is just having an attitude of okayness and kindness towards all of it. And that is, I think that's something that concentration and insight approaches don't really by themselves bring. So I think just, yeah, we're trying to sell the fact that if you do this stuff, it'll probably be better in your overall path. I think that's kind of the, if anything, I think that is probably just a good thing to do. And there's so many ways to do it. And also for people that maybe just do IFS or just do emotional work, I think seeing how it folds into this broader path of meditation is actually really important, because one failure mode that Robert Bea, who is a huge influence for both of us, he actually talks about in one of his talks, is that you can kind of be stuck in this water of only thinking about trauma and only thinking about emotions and feelings. Not to say thinking about them at all is bad, but kind of creating a box for yourself, and that's the only way that things can happen. But in some ways, have doing a lot of that work, it allows for a really beautiful and flourishing meditation practice, within on the dimensions that we're kind of talking about with the path of towards more concentration, towards more insight, and and what that progressive loop, that virtuous cycle progresses towards, is really just like an opening to a greater sense of well-being, freedom, liberation, spaciousness, this general way of having more freedom to do more things in the world. It's not just this inner sense of, it's not just an inner thing. It allows, it should allow a greater sense of showing up to your world, showing up to your gifts, showing up to your skills, and yeah, just kind of having a greater presence and aliveness.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, this failure mode that parts work or IFS doesn't really have an ambitious um, goal. Uh, and if people like try to then think of this ambitious goal for themselves, what I often see is, and what I think I also adopted at some point, is I'm going to heal all the exiles, and then
Mm.
I'll be free from all the pain and suffering. And this is flawed in some sense, because one, not all of your trauma is, or not all of the pain that you're carrying is what you inherited in this life. And not all the painful feelings that you're carrying has some biographical content associated with it. Like there can be like cultural pain or ancestral pain that you are carrying in your body. And yeah, this is where bringing in these wider frameworks can be really useful and valuable. And there's also this thing that the parts that you have access to, the parts that you are sensitive to or that you can attend, uh, this is limited by uh, things like your sensory clarity, your um, ability to concentrate deeply, your level of equanimity. And so when you prioritize these other qualities, these other meditation practices, when you prioritize concentration practices or insight practices, you become more sensitive to what other parts might be with there very much in plain sight, but you haven't been able to attend to. And so in that sense, by developing better sensory clarity, by connecting with your body, paying attention to it uh, for longer duration, and for like looking for subtle details happening, you can now attend to parts that were in some sense, yeah, seeking your help, but you weren't unavailable, that you were not available to. And so yeah, tying it all up, meditation can be really useful for parts work, no matter where you are in your healing journey. And parts work can be really useful for meditation, no matter where you are in your meditation journey.
Totally, totally. That's great. Yeah, and I think yeah, there's a few things that come. Yeah, I think that's great. I think there are a lot of ways to go about it, and it's interesting. It's interesting to answer, like, what is all this for? Like, what is kind of the end goal, or is there even an end goal?
Hmm.
Uh, and I think it's interesting because I think we both, what unites us in our friendship and being able to talk about this stuff and just our own practices, is this conception of, like, quote unquote the path.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see, like, what is the path exactly? Like, what are we, what is it? And I think for both of us, there was, or for me especially, there's this idea of awakening, enlightenment, spiritual attainment, or just this, end state or something. And I think that was my initial conception of it, and it's really evolved over time, where I don't necessarily think of it as this milestone moment, of like, oh, I achieved this thing and all my problems will be solved. I think that's actually not a helpful way of seeing it. It's not actually this is like kind of grand party or whatever. But what I think is actually there, the there that's there is understanding, you know, in some ways it's not helpful talking about the concepts, but this whole podcast is about the concepts of what we're of IFS and everything. So it's worth pointing to, knowing that this is not the thing, and knowing that there's a lot there, but this philosophy, or this experience of non-duality, and the seeing of just having an experiential sense of connectedness, drop of separation. Non-dual means not two, and it means like not having this sense of you and other and the self and the world, and seeing this, just feeling alienation. Yeah, and there's a lot more there that we're not really going to be able to cover in the next few minutes, in our final minutes, but I think that's kind of what we see as the path, and all the things of moving one's life to kind of revolve, or to kind of like fold in those understandings. It affects ethics, it affects friendships, it affects your job, it affects just the way you go about your way of being in the world, towards trying to help others, and towards understanding. I think that is something that, it's an ambitious goal to have. To have that way of being as the goal, I think, is pretty powerful, and that's, I think, in some ways the reason we're talking about this at all, because all of these tools support one in doing that, and I definitely support me. I think they support you as well in kind of moving towards that way of being in the world.
Definitely, definitely. And yeah, one other thing that I wanted to explore was uh, like other overlaps of parts work and meditation, where parts work and meditation both work synergistically. So until now, we have been talking about how both can support each other independently, but um, we both have had experiences where we have been able to spontaneously use parts work in our sets to move through something, to experience more freedom and spaciousness. And yeah, so curious to hear how that has played out for you, and if you have any recommendations or moves that you would recommend people experiment with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting, because the bigger question that I find is, what even is meditation, and what even, like, it
Yeah.
in some ways, right? It's like this global class of like, it's a way of relating to your inner interiority, and like having different ways of moving your conscious experience, like moving your conscious experience towards building concentration and like stability of awareness, moving it towards like noticing things, and that builds sensory clarity. There's kind of moving it towards a way of being that allows for more of experience, which creates equanimity. There's uh noticing and amplifying like heart qualities and the qualities of love, and there's just so many qualities of experience, and meditation is this general class of things that allows for that.
Right.
Parts work is different, where it's like, there's techniques, and there's steps, and there's kind of frameworks and assumptions and all that. But what's interesting is, I think that with a lot of parts work practice, it ends up just becoming a lot faster. Like sometimes you won't even realize that you're doing all this at once. And I think that's how stuff works, where like, initially, when you learn a thing, you need the steps, like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and
And
it's helpful to have good pedagogy there, and to have, you know um like a process that's aware that it is a process, and that it's there
yeah,
to teach people. And at the same time, that's not the thing itself. The thing itself is just doing it, and eventually you kind of let go from needing these steps towards just kind of free forming it and freestyling with it, where yeah, maybe like I'll be working with difficult body sensations and in meditation, and then like, okay, instead of cutting it through, let me just try to ask it, let's see if there's a part there, or it's a personality thing in the psyche. Then I interface with it and dialogue with it, and bring it kindness. And sometimes even just the act of putting attention towards a thing, if it's kind of small, will allow that to happen non-verbally or spontaneously over the course of a few seconds. um, and then maybe, as I shift and change, like the edge of my meditation practice comes in, where I've been doing some visualization and deity yoga practice, and that maybe comes in and supports me. And it's really, it just all blends together, and not kind of this gray singularity, but towards this like very alive, vibrant ecosystem of moves and actions, which I don't know, it's just really fun. Like I think at the end of the day, what I like about this stuff is that it just becomes like a fun way of seeing life. It's like a fun way of interacting and being with myself.
I love that answer. And uh, there's again like so many interesting thrillers that I could pick from that. But like if I wanted to like go into specifics of like what some of these moves could be, uh, to give an example, a very simple and accessible example would be that of hindrances. Uh,
Mm,
a lot of meditation literature talks about these hindrances that come up in your practice, like sloth or like ignorance, or yeah, I don't know all the hindrances, but basically the idea is that you can take any hindrance and see it as a part that's trying to protect you. And so rather than having this frame of I need to fight the hindrances or transcend them or somehow get rid of them or somehow just, yeah, win over them, you can take this more kinder, compassionate approach where you see the hindrance as a part. If you're feeling restless in your meditation state, maybe try to look for a part that is restless. When I did this once, I discovered a very young part that just wanted to play, and that was just, yeah, I think at some level sick of sitting in school classrooms, and yeah, just wanted to be out in the playground and just move freely. And I think, yeah, that was a really illuminating experience for me, and that like completely changed my relationship to meditation. And like you can do this with any difficulty that basically arises in your sit, even without even interacting with the part, just bringing in this frame that, hey, there's this someone here that is trying to protect me or needs help or needs something from me. And then trying to connect with that part and understanding its needs, or what it is trying to get for you, or what it is protecting you from. This is such a power move that can bring so much love and ease in your meditation practice. And then there's also this thing of how uh, the insight practices that get you to notice the three marks can be somewhat challenging, but when you are doing parts work, it's so much easier to notice how like dukkha gets created, where a part of you like is trying to protect you and is trying to like uh, yeah, keep some painful feeling away from you, and that is what, like, let's say creates anxiety for you. And so you get to see that in a very animated way, and you notice the same pattern then happening across a lot of different parts. And so then it's now easier for you to see that compared to seeing it in a very general or abstract way. And similarly, like seeing things like impermanence, where you see how your parts are shifting over time, or even within the same session, the part that you initially interacted with, who was a critical voice shaming you or saying derogatory thing, by the end of the session like becomes this yeah, loving, watchful protector part. And you see how everything that arises in your experiences like so much in flux. And so in that sense, like taking the concepts from meditation literature and like putting a parts work frame or spin to it can bring so much life to that idea and make it much more accessible for you.
yeah, totally. I think a lot of the frameworks and structures and concepts from early Buddhism, from Theravada, like the five hindrances, three marks of existence. So five hindrances are, yeah, sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, skeptical doubt. Like, and then they're seen as these aspects, and it's great that this is documented because then it's like a checklist. There's so many checklists, right? And checklists are helpful. Just like noticing, like, okay, in my experience, are any of these happening? And allows you to see it clearly without versus just totally being blended in it. But yeah, like you said, I think bringing an IFS or bringing a parts work and a loving somatic view to all this and way of perceiving it just upgrades it. And I think that it's something that is in some ways just missing from early Buddhism, in my opinion. And Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism get at it, but it can be a bit inaccessible. But I view a lot of the path as blending this modern way of working with emotions and inner ecology to work with this kind of really helpful framework for insight. and and just having an attitude of curiosity and understanding, and just like it allows you in that moment to unblend. And over the long run, I think it's typically far better than just pure pushing through. And sometimes, it's okay if you're sleepy in a meditation. It doesn't mean like never meditate and just do IFS. Like there are times when it's helpful just to like stand up and do the typical remedies and practices of in that session working through. But if it's repetitive and if it's like recurring, there might be some kind of larger pattern there that I think is helpful. For me, there has often been at times aversion to even just sitting down and practicing, and doing some kind of parts work is helpful. And what's really interesting is that by having this frame as well, and this is kind of a broader thing, but any life advice or any type, or maybe not any life advice, any psychological frameworks can be interpreted through the parts work lens.
Yeah.
So Ken McLeod in Wake Up to Your Life often talks about common obstacles towards practice, or common resistances towards sitting practice, and those are all really helpful. But each of those are little checks to see like, oh, are those parts that I have? Are those parts that are active for me? So it allows you to see in your own experience, is that true for me? And not just take it as some concept or something that happens for people. Like, is this a thing that's happening to you, and how much is it? And I feel like that's a very powerful way of seeing it.
Yeah, yeah. The general feel I get when I hear you talking about meditation, like you did here a few minutes ago, and in general in our conversations, is that uh, this feeling of having a lot of degrees of freedom, and uh, which is, I think, what parts work brings to self-exploration, like all these like very interesting moves that you can make. And so you have this like more and more abundance of degrees of freedom, the different ways in which you can move within your own mind, within your body, and that allows for exploration, which is so much more free and playful. And that playfulness like comes through when you talk about your meditation practice. And I feel when you have this playful, free, spacious approach to meditation, when you have this kind of relationship with meditation, it's also so much more easier to sustain that relationship and go deeper, compared to if you have this relationship where oh, I need to like meditate, I need to like learn to concentrate, or like this grindy approach, which over time, like if you have that kind of relationship with meditation, it's natural that meditation might often not feel good, and that relationship will break down in some form. And yeah, compared to this like playful, open, spacious relationship where you just deepen it more and more and have fun doing it. Because yeah, we all know it can be a painful journey, right? It has its own adventures and
Yeah.
its own pitfalls and dangers. And so having this playful relationship with meditation can be such a big asset.
Yeah, and I think like, yeah, what it's almost like in simple terms, it's just learning how to enjoy the process.
Yeah.
Because I think there's two sides. There's the failure mode of, people who want to meditate. There's like, I have to meditate every day, and when I don't meditate every day, I'm doing it wrong. And I honestly I don't really have a regular meditation practice sometimes. That's actually, I think I'm working on, and I have been working on for many years. And there's times where I do, but in general, I don't meditate daily. Or in some ways I don't meditate daily. In some ways I definitely do. But what I mean by that is eventually, like the idea of progress in meditation, it's more like how much of this is like suffused into your life, and how much of this is like into your way of being, and like living your dharma, and living in the with the dharma, and just viewing it as just it's just a way of being. Not sure what else to say there. And yeah, and then having that, it's a different benchmark. It's like not about, did I get my 10, 15, 30 hour day in every day, which is important, but it's different. And then similarly, for people coming from the emotional work side, there's this like what is the end game, or what is like it's helpful to do, but at the same time, like, especially when you're like paying for someone, or like paying for therapists, it's like, is it, there's some conception like you just have to pay for a therapist for the rest of your life or something, and that's not exactly true either. is especially when you kind of develop a way of working with yourself, you become much more robust and in some ways anti-fragile in kind of the Nassim Taleb sense towards difficulty and difficult experience. Like difficult experience becomes a thing that you can enjoy because it will like allow you to explore more parts and more triggers and open up more. And I don't think it's this thing where like you're completely, totally healed from every single
Yeah.
trauma, not just every single trauma, but like every single difficult thing, and there's no bad emotions or difficult emotions that come. It's more just like a way of enjoying your interiority, I think is a better frame of it. And but then both of these goals kind of intertwine, and it really it's just about enjoying the process and getting to a place where you're enjoying like the practice, whatever your practice is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think one other thing that I wanted to explore before we move towards closing is, yeah, a topic that's again a favorite interest, common interest of ours. Like, so the Buddhist notion of emptiness and how that relates to parts work. I think it's especially interesting because one of the failure modes that we talked about parts work is this, like ending up refining things or making things more solid. And so bringing in some understanding of emptiness or seeing how parts work can help you bring that understanding of emptiness can be really useful. And one of the ways in which like this has recently landed for me, so how parts work has helped me get a better understanding of emptiness or fabrication is, um, I like heard in some Dharma talk that whenever there's fabrication happening, there's in some sense always two parts involved: a part that is creating an image, and then another part that is reacting to that image. And so, a quick example of this would be, uh, let's say you are in a social situation and someone says something mean, or someone just says something that you can perceive as mean, or just gives you a look that you can perceive as judgmental. And even though that look itself might have been completely random. And so that sensory input comes in, and a part of you takes up the responsibility of weaving that sensory input into a story that, oh, that person is being mean towards us and they are judging us for being this way. And like this image gets created. And to this image, you might get a reaction from, let's say, a part that gets angry at the situation and gets mean in response, or a part that maybe gets socially anxious and like starts worrying about it or starts repeating the conversation in their head. And uh, once you see this, you can see this almost everywhere. Anytime there's any suffering you are investigating, you can look for a part that is uh, responding defensively, and you can look for a part that's simulating a reality in which you are under threat.
Mhm.
And you can interact with both of these parts in very interesting ways. And yeah, also get a very real felt sense for how these stories get built up in real time in our heads and then cause us suffering.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's kind of where I was thinking about this too. Where I think a big failure mode of this type of work is conflating it with truth seeking. And I think that is a really important but difficult point to make. And I don't fully know how to address it. But one thing I've noticed is, yeah, with all these narratives, there's this idea like, oh, these are real or these are true. And even, as we go deeper, at one level, with a little bit of parts work and seeing emptiness, we see like, oh, okay, I'm constructing these narratives. Like, what might it actually be? But there's kind of a subtler thing where like, oh, then what's actually the truth, and
Mhm.
what is really the truth? And it's difficult because it's in some ways it's it is your truth. It is a subjective truth. It is the truth that is what you're experiencing, but it's not necessarily the truth of consensus reality, or like especially when in an interpersonal thing, it's like, oh, this person did this and I felt this, and I there's a part of me that felt really hurt, therefore they hurt me. Like, I don't know, it gets really tricky because then it's like, what are their intentions and not. And even uncovering going into exile work and things like that, that's where it gets like much trickier, where I think one question I've had, and in some ways Maria had, is like, are these exiles real, or like, is that when the hurt happened and then things happen? I think in some ways, yeah, probably, but in other ways, it's like I think taking it as an imaginal exercise in some ways can be more helpful, because by viewing it as like, by having that view of like this happened, and then like I know it happened for sure because it came up within an IFS or parts work session, therefore I need to change my life around it. It might be true, but it also might be helpful to kind of give some space to it. And I bring that up because I think there's a lot of societal discussion and uncertainty around, repressed memories or forgotten memories, and that I think can get quite involved with exile work. And I think there's a thing where like, there used to be a just total dismissal of it, where it's like, oh, that's not true, you're just lying, you're making it up. I don't think that's right. But I also don't want to go the full other route of being like, oh, you can't necessarily believe in the sense of this happened in, historical reality at the time, and then that way I did, and the way I remembered. It's just really tricky. So it's like, but having this, adopting a view of emptiness and seeing these all as ways of looking, and seeing these all as like moving towards greater freedom, that I think is really helpful, because then I think you can navigate it in ways that are more skillful. um yeah, it's
Yeah,
tricky.
yeah. I think that's super valuable advice, because it's inevitable that in any kind of self-exploration, we will end up creating stories and getting attached to those stories. And especially when certain painful feelings come to the surface, and then the mind naturally looks for narratives to make sense of that painful feelings. And the thing is, it will just, in some sense, cling to whatever narratives are available in that moment. And I feel this happens across like almost all healing modalities in some sense, where people experience something and like weave stories around that. And actually, those stories can lead to a lot of cathartic release.
Mhm.
And uh, sometimes finding the right story or the most resonant story can be so healing, can bring so much release and freedom. And yeah, at the same time, what you said, that just being aware of this, that your mind will inevitably fabricate stories to make sense of whatever is arising. And yeah, as long as you are sensitive to that, as long as you don't get attached to any particular stories, or yeah, build up like reactions to that stories, because it's very much possible, right? That some painful feeling comes up, you weave a story around it, and then in response to that story, maybe you end up creating like resentment towards
Mhm.
a particular situation, or towards even yourself, or towards reality. And so what was going to lead you to more ease and freedom indirectly ended up just creating more suffering for you in some sense.
Yep. Yep, that's great. And it's tricky. I think there's a whole, maybe another episode or talk on that, of like this broader thing of like having the insights, like incorporating the insights of this type of work into the real world and into your relationships and into actions, because it's not this necessarily one-to-one, like, oh, I feel this thing, now I have to act on it. There is still discernment, and there can still be like patience, and
Yeah.
and understanding of like, okay, I'm feeling this now, if I feel it next week, maybe then I bring it up and try to change this relationship. But it's tricky, and that gets into ethics and actions and a whole sort of thing, a whole class of things that
Yes.
we don't have time for.
Yeah, yeah. And there's this whole other thing that we wanted to talk about, but we probably won't be able to do it justice in this conversation. This thing about parts work and psychedelics.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we can save that for another
We'll
conversation.
bookmark it.
But yeah, before we close, is there anything else on your mind that, yeah, you'd like to explore?
No, this is great. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I would love to do more of this with you.
For sure. For sure. Awesome. Till next time.
Yeah, till next time, take care.